In the shadow of the Bitter Mountain Range, 1876, a single rifle shot cracked across the crisp autumn air, followed by dozens more. By nightfall, the wagon train bound for Redemption Valley was nothing but splintered wood and motionless forms scattered across the blood-soaked earth. The notorious Rattlesnake Gang had left no survivors from the ambush at Widow's Gulch, or so they thought. Clara Hartley rested her hand on her swollen belly, feeling her unborn child shift beneath her fingers. 8 months pregnant and halfway across the country, she'd begun to wonder if leaving their small Missouri farm had been a mistake. But Thomas, her husband of 4 years, had been so certain about the opportunities awaiting them in Oregon Territory. The land is so fertile there, you can plant a seed and return the next day to find it sprouting. He told her, eyes bright with enthusiasm, as he read aloud from letters sent by his cousin, who had made the journey 3 years prior. A fresh start, Clara, for us, and for the little one. Now, as their wagon creaked along the dusty trail, Clara watched Thomas navigate their oxen team with practiced hands. The journey had been harder than either had imagined. 4 months on the trail had weathered their faces and thinned their frames, despite the relative abundance of supplies they had managed to maintain. They had joined the Jenkins-Wilson wagon train in Independence, Missouri, 26 families strong, all bound for Oregon, with dreams of orchards and farmland. Abigail Wilson, 8 months pregnant herself, and traveling with her husband Jeremiah and their 3 older children, had become Clara's closest friend on the journey. The women had spent countless evenings comparing notes on their pregnancies and sharing hopes for their children's futures in Oregon. "My Sarah will be born with pine sap on her fingers," Abigail had joked just that morning as they walked beside the wagons, taking advantage of the flat terrain to stretch their legs. "Ah, true Oregon girl," Clara had smiled, placing a hand on her own belly. "This little one is determined to be a mountain child, I think. Never kicks harder than when we're climbing slopes." The wagon train had been making good progress that day, moving steadily through a narrow valley that the trail guides assured them would open to more hospitable terrain beyond Widow's Gulch, a twisted trail that wound between 2 steep cliffs before descending toward greener lands below. When her back began to ache more intensely than usual, Clara had fallen behind the main group. "I need to rest," she called to Thomas. "Just for a few minutes. I'll catch up before you reach the gulch." Thomas had looked concerned but nodded. "Don't stray far. We'll slow the pace once we get through the narrows." "I'll just sit in that grove of pine trees," she replied, pointing to a small stand of evergreens about 50 yards from the trail. "The shade looks inviting." That simple decision those few steps away from the rutted trail had saved her life. Clara had just settled herself against the trunk of a tall pine, sighing with relief, as she took weight off her swollen ankles when the first shot rang out. The sharp crack echoed between the mountain walls, followed immediately by shouting and more gunfire. Her first instinct was to run back to the wagons, back to Thomas, but something made her freeze in place. Through the green needles, she could see riders emerging from hidden positions along the ridgeline above the pass. At least 20 men, faces obscured by bandanas, rifles in hand, descending upon the wagon train with ruthless efficiency. The sounds that followed would haunt Clara for the rest of her life. Screams, pleas for mercy, the crack of gunfire, the splintering of wood as wagons were ransacked. Trembling uncontrollably, she pressed herself against the ground behind the pine grove, one hand instinctively covering her mouth to stifle her sobs, the other wrapped protectively around her belly. Her child kicked violently as if sensing the danger. "Check for valuables, then burn what's left," called a deep voice with a slight southern drawl. "Rattler wants no trails leading back to us." From her hidden vantage point, Clara could see a tall man with a russet beard directing the others. He sat atop a powerful black stallion, watching impassively as his men moved methodically from body to body, wagon to wagon. Minutes stretched into hours as Clara remained frozen in place, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too deeply. The afternoon sun began to sink behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the valley. The bandits had finished their grim work, loading supplies and valuables onto pack horses. "Anything worth taking from the last wagon?" asked the bearded leader. "Just some letters and women's things," replied one of his men. "Nothing valuable." "Torch it with the rest," the leader commanded. "Leave nothing but ash." As dusk settled over the massacre site, the bandits finally mounted their horses and rode north, following a trail different from the one the wagon train had been traveling. Clara remained hidden until the sound of hoofbeats had long faded, her body cramped, and her throat parched from fear and thirst. Only when the first stars appeared did she dare move her joints stiff and aching as she struggled to her feet. The baby had gone eerily still, and a fresh wave of terror washed over her. Placing both hands on her belly, she waited until she felt a subtle movement, then nearly collapsed with relief. "We're alive," she whispered. "We're still here." The words felt hollow as she forced herself to approach the scene of destruction. The wagons had been set ablaze, but the autumn dampness had prevented them from burning completely. Blackened frameworks stood like skeletons against the night sky, and worse, much worse, were the bodies. Clara moved through the carnage on trembling legs, searching desperately for Thomas. She found him near their wagon, his blue shirt darkened with blood, his kind face frozen in an expression of disbelief. A single shot to the chest had taken him from her. She knelt beside him, unable to speak, unable to weep, a void opening inside her that seemed to swallow all emotion. With gentle fingers, she closed his eyes and removed the brass compass his father had given him on their wedding day. It was still pointing north, measuring direction, in a world that suddenly made no sense. "I'll tell our child about you," she finally whispered, tucking the compass into her dress pocket. "Every day they'll know who their father was." As night deepened, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was alone, heavily pregnant, miles from the nearest settlement, with winter approaching in mountain country. The bandits had taken all the horses and oxen, most of the food supplies had been stolen or destroyed, and she had no idea which direction led to safety. Moving mechanically, Clara searched through the wreckage, gathering anything that might help her survive. A charred blanket, a dented tin cup, a small knife overlooked by the bandits, a half loaf of bread that had somehow survived in an overturned chest, a metal canteen dented but intact. The night air grew increasingly cold as she worked the mountain winds cutting through her wool dress. She needed shelter, especially with clouds gathering that promised rain by morning. Tying her meager supplies into a bundle using the blanket, Clara forced herself to think practically. The pine grove offered little protection from the elements. The remaining wagon frames were unstable and exposed. Her only option was to follow the narrow game trail she had noticed earlier, leading up into the hills, hoping to find a rock overhang or some natural windbreak. With one last look at Thomas's body, Clara pressed her hand to her lips, then to his forehead. "I don't know how, but I'll survive this," she promised him. "For our child, for us." The trail was difficult to follow in the darkness, but the rising moon provided just enough light to see a few feet ahead. Each step required careful consideration. A broken ankle now would mean certain death. After nearly an hour of slow progress uphill, the path opened onto a small plateau dotted with scrub oak and boulders. Beyond them, the darker shadow of a rock face rose against the night sky. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm her as she made her way toward the cliff, hoping to find some shelter at its base. The first drops of rain began to fall just as she reached the rocks. Running her hand along the rough stone, she moved sideways, searching desperately for any kind of overhang. Her fingers encountered empty space, a gap in the rock face. Heart pounding, Clara leaned forward to peer into the darkness. A cave opening perhaps 5 feet high, and nearly as wide cut into the mountainside. She hesitated only briefly before the increasing rainfall made her decision for her. The cave's interior was dry and surprisingly deep, extending at least 15 feet into the mountain. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, Clara could make out the roughly circular shape of the main chamber. The air carried an earthy, musky scent, but nothing immediately threatening. Setting down her small bundle of supplies, Clara sank to the ground, her back against the cave wall. For the first time since the massacre, she allowed herself to weep. Silent tears at first, then great heaving sobs that echoed in the stone chamber, releasing some measure of the grief and terror she'd been holding at bay. When the emotional storm finally subsided, exhaustion claimed her. She arranged the charred blanket beneath her as best she could, using her bundle of supplies as a pillow. As she drifted towards sleep, the baby began to move again, more gently now. "Just us now, little one," she murmured, placing a protective hand over her belly. "But we'll find a way." Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the mountain and creating a curtain of water across the cave entrance. Inside, Clara fell into an exhausted sleep, unaware that the cave had been recently occupied or that its previous inhabitant would soon return. Clara woke with a start, momentarily disoriented by the unfamiliar stone walls surrounding her. Daylight filtered weakly through the cave entrance, revealing details she'd missed in the darkness. Scratch marks scoring the walls, a depression in the dirt floor, lined with dried grasses and pine needles, scattered bones in a far corner. The realization hit her with nauseating force. This wasn't just any cave. This was a wolf's den. Her breath caught as she frantically scanned the chamber for signs of the animal's recent presence. The bedding looked undisturbed for some time, the bones old and picked clean. Perhaps the wolf had already sought different shelter for the coming winter, or was out hunting. Either way, Clara knew she couldn't stay. Rising awkwardly to her feet, she gathered her meager supplies, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. The events of yesterday crashed back into her consciousness. Thomas the wagon train, all those people gone. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she braced herself against the cave wall until it passed. She hadn't eaten since yesterday morning, and her canteen held only a few precious sips of water. Finding food and water had to be her priority, followed by safer shelter. The rain had stopped overnight, leaving behind a mist that clung to the mountainside and obscured the valley below. As Clara stepped cautiously from the cave, she tried to get her bearings. The plateau stretched before her, dotted with scrub oak and loose boulders. The path she'd followed upward was barely visible, a narrow track winding down towards where the massacre site would be. Beyond the plateau, the mountain continued upward, its peak lost in low clouds. Logic told her to head downhill, to follow the wagon trail forward to whatever settlement might lie ahead. But the thought of passing through the remains of the wagon train, of seeing Thomas and the others again, made her stomach clench. And what if the bandits returned? Clara settled on a compromise. She would circle around the plateau, avoiding the direct path back to the trail, and find a vantage point where she could see the valley and determine the safest route forward. Her first task, however, was water. The rainfall would have left plenty behind if she knew where to look. Moving slowly among the scrub oaks, she searched for natural depressions and rocks where water might collect. After nearly 30 minutes, she found a small hollow in a granite outcropping, filled with about 2 cups of relatively clear rainwater. Using a corner of her blanket as a filter, she carefully filled her canteen, then drank deeply from what remained in the rock basin. The cool water revived her, clearing some of the fog from her mind. Food would be harder. Scanning the underbrush, she looked for anything recognizable: berries, edible plants, mushrooms. Her knowledge was limited mostly to what grew in Missouri gardens, but she had picked up some information during their journey west. The Pawnee guide who had accompanied them through Nebraska territory had pointed out various plants, explaining which provided medicine or nourishment. A patch of familiar leaves caught her eye, wild onions growing in a sunny spot between rocks. The bitter bulbs weren't appetizing, but she knew they were safe. She gathered a handful along with some pine needles that could be steeped for tea. As she straightened, a sharp pain lanced through her abdomen. Clara froze one hand, instinctively going to her belly. Not now, not here. She was still weeks from her due date, but stress and trauma could trigger early labor. She'd seen it happen to a woman in their wagon train after a river crossing gone wrong. The pain subsided after a moment, and she exhaled shakily. A practice contraction, perhaps, or just the strain of her current circumstances. She couldn't afford to panic. Moving with greater urgency now, Clara continued her exploration of the plateau. Near its eastern edge, she found what she was seeking: a clear view down into the valley. From this height, she could see the entire scene of yesterday's horror, though distance mercifully blurred the details. More importantly, she could see the trail continuing beyond Widow's Gulch, winding through the valley before disappearing into a dense forest some miles ahead. A thin column of smoke rose from within that forest, a settlement, a ranch, or just travelers making camp. Whatever it was, it represented her best hope of rescue. The question was how to reach it. The direct route meant returning to the massacre site and following the established trail. The alternative was to forge her own path around the mountain, a dangerous proposition in her condition, especially with limited supplies. While she debated, a movement in the valley below caught her attention. Riders, 4 of them, approaching the wagon train from the direction of the forest. For a moment, hope surged in her chest. Rescuers perhaps come to investigate why the wagon train hadn't arrived as expected. But as she watched their cautious approach, the way they spread out and circled the site rather than riding directly in, Clara's instincts warned her otherwise. These weren't rescuers. These were scouts checking to ensure their job had been completed. Her suspicions were confirmed when one rider dismounted beside the remains of the lead wagon and knelt to examine something on the ground. Even from this distance, his methodical movement suggested he was reading the story written in the soil and ash. Clara retreated from the edge of the plateau, her heart pounding. If they were skilled trackers, they might discover that someone had survived. They might find her trail leading up to the cave. She needed to move to find a safer location, but first she needed better supplies and a way to obscure her tracks. Returning to the cave, Clara forced herself to think practically. The wolf's den, dangerous as it might be, offered one significant advantage: no one would willingly follow her trail inside. If the animal had abandoned it for the season, it might actually be her safest option until she determined whether those riders were friend or foe. She sharpened her small knife on a piece of stone, turning it from a kitchen tool into something that might serve as a weapon if necessary. Next, she gathered pine boughs and used them to brush away her footprints leading to and from the cave entrance, working backward to cover her trail. Inside, she arranged her blanket and supplies in the deepest part of the cave, where they wouldn't be visible from the entrance. If she needed to hide quickly, she could retreat to this space. The sound of thunder rumbled in the distance, and Clara glanced out to see dark clouds gathering over the mountain peaks. Another storm approached, which could either work for or against her. Rain would wash away her tracks, but would also make travel even more treacherous. As the first heavy drops began to fall, she made her decision. She would wait out the storm in the cave, use the rainfall to mask her movements, then attempt to circle around the mountain toward the smoke she'd seen in the forest. If the wolf returned in the meantime, she gripped the knife tighter, knowing it would offer little protection, but finding some comfort in not being entirely defenseless. Hours passed as the storm raged outside, wind driving rain into the mouth of the cave. Clara used the time to rest and prepare steeping pine needles in rainwater caught from the cave entrance to make a tea that helped ease her hunger and provided some nourishment. By late afternoon, the thunder had moved beyond the mountains, though a steady rain continued to fall. As Clara sat in the growing darkness, conserving her energy, a sound from the cave entrance made her blood run cold. Not the pattering of rain or the whistle of wind, but the deliberate crunch of a footstep on stone. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, knife clutched in her trembling hand. Had the riders found her trail despite her precautions, or had the cave's rightful occupant returned? The silhouette that appeared against the gray light of the cave entrance belonged to neither bandit nor wolf. A man stood there, tall and broad-shouldered, rain dripping from the brim of his hat and the fringes of his buckskin jacket. In one hand, he held a rifle casually, but ready. He remained perfectly still, allowing his eyes to adjust to the cave's interior. "I know you're in here," he said, his voice a low rumble that matched the fading thunder. "I saw your tracks before the rain washed most of them away." Clara remained motionless, knife still gripped in her trembling hand. The silhouette at the cave entrance neither advanced nor retreated. "I'm not with them," the stranger said, his voice softer now. "Not with the Rattlesnake Gang, the butchers who did that work down in the valley." Still, she didn't respond. Trust had become a luxury she couldn't afford. He sighed, then slowly lowered his rifle, setting it against the cave wall. "I've been tracking the Rattlesnake Gang for 4 months, followed them through 3 territories. I was too late to stop what happened to your wagon train, but maybe not too late to help a survivor." The word survivor broke through Clara's caution. "How did you know?" she asked, her voice rough from disuse. 26 graves in the soil down there. 27 bodies by my count. Someone took time to bury the dead, but left one space empty. Someone gathered supplies from the wreckage, left tracks heading up this way. He took another step forward, then stopped as she shifted in the darkness. "My name's Caleb Weston. I was a guide for the Western Union before the Rattlesnake Gang murdered my sister's family near Cheyenne. Now, I'm the only one still hunting them after the marshals gave up." Slowly, Clara moved forward enough that he could see her, though she kept the knife visible. "I'm Clara Hartley," she said, watching his expression carefully as her condition became visible in the dim light. "And you're standing in a wolf's den, Mr. Weston." Caleb Weston froze at Clara's words, his eyes flicking to the scratch marks on the cave walls that he'd failed to notice in his focus on tracking the survivor. "Wolf's den," he repeated quietly, instinctively lowering his voice. "And recently used from the smell of it. Gray wolf, I'd guess not a whole pack." "Is that supposed to be comforting?" Clara asked, still gripping her small knife. A hint of a smile touched the corner of Caleb's mouth there, and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. "Lone wolves generally keep to themselves, unless they're cornered or starving. But we shouldn't press our luck." He glanced back at the cave entrance where rain continued to fall steadily. "Storm's not letting up anytime soon. We need to move to safer ground before nightfall." Clara challenged, unwilling to simply trust this stranger, despite his apparent knowledge of her situation. Caleb studied her for a moment, taking in her condition, the knife in her hand, the determination in her exhausted eyes. "Mrs. Hartley, you're welcome to continue alone if that's your preference," he said evenly. "But you're 8 months pregnant in mountain country with winter coming on. Those men I saw checking the massacre site weren't just passing through. They were making sure their job was finished, which means they suspect someone survived." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Clara weighed her options. This man was right about one thing. Her chances of survival alone were slim, at best, impossible at worst. Yet trusting a stranger carried its own risks. "How do I know you're not with them?" she asked bluntly. "Sent to find any survivors?" Caleb unbuttoned his jacket and pulled aside his shirt collar, revealing an ugly scar that ran from his collarbone toward his shoulder. "Jeremiah Rattler gave me this 6 months ago, when his gang attacked my sister's homestead." His voice remained steady, but his eyes hardened. "They killed my sister, her husband, and their 12-year-old son. Only person they left alive was their daughter Emma. She's 6. She hid in the root cellar, just like you hid in those pines." The raw honesty in his voice convinced Clara more than the scar itself. She lowered the knife slightly. "I saw my husband die," she said, the words catching in her throat. "Thomas and our friends, 26 families all gone." "I know," Caleb said simply, "and I'm sorry I didn't get here in time to stop it. But we need to move now, if we're going to stay ahead of both the gang and the wolf that calls this home." A distant rumble of thunder punctuated his words. The storm wasn't abating. If anything, it was intensifying. "Where would we go in this?" Clara gestured toward the cave entrance. "I've got a cabin about 5 miles north of here. It's well hidden, stocked with supplies, and secure enough to keep out unwanted visitors, human or animal." Clara made her decision, pragmatism overriding caution. "All right, Mr. Weston, I'll go with you." She gathered her meager supplies. "But know this, I may be in a difficult situation, but I'm not helpless." "Wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise, Mrs. Hartley." He retrieved his rifle and moved toward the entrance. "And it's just Caleb. Formalities seem pointless under the circumstances." "Then I'm Clara," she replied, following him to the cave mouth, where they both paused, surveying the rain-soaked landscape. Caleb pulled a heavy oilskin coat from his pack and held it out to her. "Put this on. It'll keep you dry and hide your condition if we run into trouble." The coat enveloped her completely, the sleeves hanging well past her fingertips. It smelled of wood smoke, pine, and the indefinable scent of long days in the wilderness. She rolled the sleeves back enough to free her hands, grateful for the unexpected warmth. "We'll stick to rocky ground when we can," Caleb instructed as they set out, "and use the stream bed where it's not too dangerous. Water washes away tracks." They moved slowly through the downpour, Caleb constantly scanning their surroundings, occasionally adjusting their course to utilize natural cover or harder terrain that wouldn't hold footprints. He matched his pace to Clara's, offering a steady arm when the path grew slippery or steep. After an hour of difficult progress, Clara's strength began to flag. Her legs trembled with each step, and spots danced before her eyes. Caleb noticed immediately. "We'll rest a moment," he said, guiding her beneath the shelter of a massive cedar where the ground remained relatively dry. From his pack, he produced a small tin of jerky and a flask. "Eat something. It's buffalo tough but nourishing." Clara accepted the offering, gratefully discovering how ravenous she truly was as she chewed the dried meat. The flask contained water sweetened with what tasted like wild honey. "A trick I learned from a Cheyenne guide," Caleb explained when she commented on the flavor. "Adds energy when you need it most." As she rested, he disappeared briefly, returning with several large leaves, which he twisted into a rough cup shape. "Drink," he said, collecting fresh rainwater in the leaf cup and offering it to her. "Dehydration is dangerous, especially in your condition." The thoughtful gesture, so simple yet so essential, brought unexpected tears to Clara's eyes. After the brutality she'd witnessed, this small kindness felt almost unbearable. Caleb pretended not to notice her emotional response, busying himself with checking their back trail instead. His restraint granted her the privacy to compose herself. "We've got about 3 more miles, he said when she indicated she was ready to continue. "The worst of the terrain is behind us now." The rain began to ease as they resumed their journey, though low clouds still obscured the mountain peaks. Caleb led them through a series of switchbacks that climbed gradually along the mountainside, eventually bringing them to a narrow saddle between two ridges. "Just over this rise," he said, pointing ahead. As they crested the saddle, Clara saw their destination, a small cabin tucked against the mountainside, so perfectly positioned that it blended into the natural rock formation behind it. A casual observer might miss it entirely unless they knew exactly where to look. "It's not much," Caleb said as they approached the structure. "Just a trapper's cabin I've modified over the years, but it's solid, dry, and defensible." The cabin proved to be larger than it first appeared, with sturdy log walls and a stone chimney. Two small windows shuttered from within flanked a heavy wooden door secured with an iron latch. Caleb unlocked the door, standing aside to allow Clara to enter first. The interior was simple, but surprisingly comfortable. A stone fireplace with cooking hooks, a sturdy table with two chairs, shelves stocked with provisions, and a narrow bed built into one wall. Furs and woven blankets provided warmth, while an array of tools and weapons hanging from wall pegs spoke to the practical nature of the cabin's usual occupant. "You'll take the bed," he said, moving to light a fire in the hearth. "I'll use my bedroll near the door." Clara sank gratefully onto a chair, removing the oversized coat now that they were safely indoors. The warmth from the growing fire gradually chased the chill from her bones as she watched Caleb move efficiently around the small space, hanging their wet garments to dry and preparing what smelled like a venison stew from preserved ingredients. "You said you've been tracking the rattlesnake gang for months," she said finally. "How many of them are there?" Caleb added herbs to the pot before answering. 14 that I know of. Jeremiah Rattler leads them. His brother Henry is second in command, the one with the russet beard you might have seen giving orders during the attack. They mentioned someone named Rattler, Clara confirmed. Said he wanted no trails leading back to them. Caleb nodded grimly. That's their pattern. They don't just rob. They eliminate anyone who could identify them. The territorial authorities have been searching for them for 3 years, but the gang moves between jurisdictions and the mountains provide too many places to hide. Why haven't you gone to the law with what you know? A shadow crossed Caleb's weathered face. I tried. County Sheriff in Cheyenne took my statement, forwarded it to the territorial marshal. 3 weeks later, the marshal's office declared the case closed, blamed it on Sioux raiders, despite evidence to the contrary. He stirred the pot with more force than necessary. Found out later that Jeremiah Rattler has connections to powerful men in the territorial government, men who benefit from the gang's activities. Some say the governor's own brother receives a percentage of their take. Clara absorbed this information with growing alarm. So, there's no justice to be had through proper channels. Not for folks like us, Caleb confirmed, which is why I've been tracking them myself. I was close to finding their main camp when they suddenly changed course and headed toward Widow's Gulch. I followed, but he gestured vaguely toward the direction of the massacre site. I was too late. They took something from the surveyor's wagon, Clara said. I heard them arguing about a strong box they couldn't open right away. One of them said it contained land deeds. Caleb's head snapped up, his attention sharpened. Land deeds? What kind of land deeds? I don't know for certain, but the surveyor Mr. Patterson mentioned during our journey that he'd been commissioned to verify boundaries for new settlement areas, something about recent treaties with the Blackfoot that opened territories near Snake River. That explains it, Caleb said, understanding dawning on his face. If Patterson had official deeds and boundary claims for that land, those documents would be worth a fortune to certain interests in Portland. The Rattlesnake Gang must have learned about them somehow. So 26 families died for some pieces of paper, Clara said bitterly. People have died for less. Caleb replied, his tone equally grim. But this gives us an advantage. If they're transporting valuable deeds, they won't risk the main trails where they might encounter military patrols. They'll stick to hidden routes. Routes I know as well as they do. He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and handed it to Clara. Eat. Regain your strength. Tomorrow, we need to decide our next move. As she ate the surprisingly flavorful stew, Clara considered the strange turn her life had taken. 2 days ago, she had been a settler's wife, with simple dreams of an Oregon farm. Now, she was a widow, a survivor, and reluctant ally to a mountain man on a mission of vengeance. These men, she said quietly, if we find them, what then? Caleb's eyes met hers across the table, their gray depths cold as winter ice. Then they'll answer for what they've done to my family and to yours." In the silence that followed, the baby kicked vigorously as if responding to the tension in the air. Clara placed a protective hand over her belly, wondering what kind of world she would be bringing her child into, and whether either of them would live to see it. Dawn broke with surprising clarity after the previous day's storms. Clara woke to sunlight streaming through cracks in the cabin shutters and the scent of coffee brewing over the fire. She had slept deeply for the first time since the massacre, her body desperately claiming the rest it needed. Caleb stood at the small table, spreading a weathered map across its surface. He acknowledged her with a brief nod as she rose from the bed. "Storms passed," he said, pouring coffee into a tin cup and offering it to her. "But it's left its mark. Mountain passes to the west will be treacherous for a few days, possibly impossible in places." Clara accepted the coffee, gratefully wrapping her hands around the warm cup. "Is that good or bad for us?" "Both. It hampers the rattlesnake gang's movement, but also limits our options." He gestured to the map. "We're here. Nearest settlement is Pine Ridge, about 40 miles southeast. Under normal circumstances, 4 days' journey. Under current circumstances," Caleb's expression was grim, potentially impossible. "You're not in condition to navigate washed-out trails and rock slides. Even if you were, the gang scouts were heading in that direction when I spotted them yesterday. They may have men stationed along the regular routes watching for survivors." Clara sank into a chair, absorbing this information. "So we're trapped here. Not trapped, just limited." Caleb traced a different route on the map with his finger. "There's another option. Northeast of here, about 25 miles, there's a Cheyenne winter camp. The Chief Iron Hawk is known to me. We traded together when I guided for the Western Union." "A native camp? Would they welcome strangers?" "Not typically, but I once helped Iron Hawk's youngest son when he was caught in a flash flood. The debt between us remains open." Caleb studied the map intently. "The trail there is less affected by the storms, and the gang avoids Cheyenne territory. Too many warriors, too well organized." "What would we do there? I can't stay in a native camp indefinitely." "No, but you could stay until after your child is born." Caleb's eyes flicked briefly to her swollen belly. "Iron Hawk's people have skilled healers. Once you and the baby are strong enough to travel, they could guide you to Fort Laramie. The military presence there would offer protection the territorial authorities won't." Clara considered this option. The prospect of giving birth in a native camp was intimidating, but perhaps no more so than the alternatives. "And what would you do while I'm with the Cheyenne?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Continue tracking the rattlesnake gang. With you and your child safely away, I can move faster, take more risks." Clara recognized what he wasn't saying, that he intended to confront the gang alone, likely at the cost of his own life. The realization bothered her more than she expected. Before she could respond, a sound outside the cabin brought them both to alert. The distinctive crunch of a footstep on dried pine needles, too deliberate to be wildlife. Caleb moved silently to the window, easing the shutter open just enough to peer outside. His body tensed as he signaled for Clara to remain silent. Dropping to a crouch, he retrieved his rifle and checked that it was loaded. "3 riders," he whispered, moving slow, checking the ground. "Not Cheyenne. They're dressed like ranchers, but their horses are too fine." Clara's heart pounded. "The gang," Caleb nodded grimly. "Scouts most likely. They must have found a sign of our passage yesterday despite the rain. What do? We can't outrun them. Not with your condition, and once they find this cabin, they'll search it thoroughly." He glanced around the small space, his mind clearly racing through options. "There's a root cellar beneath the floor. Small, but you could hide there while I lead them away." "Lead them away, they'll kill you." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "They can try. I know these mountains better than they ever will." Moving quickly, Caleb rolled back a bearskin rug to reveal a trap door set into the floor. The space below was indeed small, barely large enough for a person to crouch in, but it offered the only possible hiding place. "Get in," he urged, already gathering essential supplies into a pack. "Take this." He handed her a loaded revolver. 6 shots, use them if needed, but only as a last resort. The sound would carry for miles. Clara hesitated, reluctant to separate. "How will I know when it's safe to come out?" "I'll give 3 quick whistles like a mountain bluebird," he demonstrated softly. "If I'm not back by nightfall tomorrow," he left the implication hanging. The sounds outside grew closer. No time left for debate. Clara lowered herself awkwardly into the cellar, the revolver cold and heavy in her hand. "Stay alive," she whispered as Caleb prepared to close the trap door. "You too," he replied, then sealed her into darkness. From below, Clara heard muffled movements as Caleb quickly rearranged the cabin to hide evidence of her presence. The bearskin rug was replaced over the trap door. Then the cabin door opened and closed. Silence fell. Minutes stretched painfully as Clara crouched in the darkness, one hand on her belly, as the baby shifted restlessly. The earth walls of the cellar smelled of roots and damp soil. She controlled her breathing, straining to hear what was happening outside. Distant voices reached her, men calling to each other as they approached the cabin. The door crashed open. Heavy footsteps moved across the floor, directly above her head. "Someone's been here recent," a gruff voice declared. "Ashes are still warm." "Weston," another voice replied with certainty. "Recognized his sign back in the valley. Man moves like a ghost, but he still leaves tracks for those who know how to read them." "Rattler ain't gonna like this. Thought we lost that bastard back in Wyoming." "Well, he's found us again. Question is, was he alone, or did he find that woman?" Clara's breath caught. They knew about her. Somehow they knew a woman had survived. "No sign of a woman here," the first voice said. "Check outside, see if there's 2 sets of tracks leading away." More footsteps, then the door opening and closing again. Clara remained frozen, the revolver clutched tightly. Above her, one man continued to search the cabin, his movements growing more thorough and deliberate. Something heavy scraped across the floor, the table being moved. Then clothing rustled directly above the trap door as the searcher crouched down. The bearskin rug was pulled aside. Clara raised the revolver, aiming at the trap door, her finger tight on the trigger. The wooden door creaked as fingers probed for a grip to lift it. A shout from outside broke the tension. "Riders coming fast from the east, at least 6 of them." The searcher abandoned the trap door, his footsteps pounding toward the door. "Soldiers?" "Don't think so. Looks like Cheyenne." Confusion and alarm colored their voices now. The sound of running feet, horses being mounted in haste. "Leave it. We'll find Weston and the woman later. Go." Hoofbeats receded rapidly as the intruders fled. Clara remained motionless in her hiding place, unsure if this was a trick to draw her out. Minutes passed, then an hour. The silence above became absolute. Just as Clara was debating whether to risk emerging, she heard horses approaching again, slower this time, more controlled. Voices spoke in a language she didn't recognize. The cabin door opened. The white man's sign said, "Look beneath the bear," a heavily accented voice said in English. "Where is the bear in this place?" "The floor covering," another voice replied. "It is made from bear." Footsteps approached the trap door. Clara steeled herself, aiming the revolver upward once more. The trapdoor lifted and light flooded in. A face appeared in the opening, a native man of perhaps 50. His long hair streaked with gray, his eyes sharp with intelligence. "You can lower your weapon, woman who hides like fox," he said. "Caleb Weston sends us to find you." Clara hesitated, reluctant to relinquish her only defense. The man seemed to understand her caution. "He says to tell you the bluebird calls, but his voice must come through others." He extended a hand. "I am Iron Hawk of the Cheyenne. The man who tracks the killers has saved my son's life before. Now he asks that we save yours." Slowly Clara lowered the revolver. "Where is Caleb?" Iron Hawk's expression grew serious. "He draws the evil men away from you and my people. He left trail signs for us to find you while he leads them toward the broken lands to the west. Will he be safe?" Even as she asked, Clara knew the answer. "The mountain speaks to him as it does to few white men, but those he hunts are many, and he is one." Iron Hawk helped her climb from the cellar, his strong hands gentle as he noted her condition. "Your time grows near, woman of courage. We must reach our camp before your child decides to greet the world." Outside, Clara found 4 Cheyenne warriors mounted on paint horses, their expressions impassive but not unfriendly. A 5th horse, saddled differently with a specially designed seat that would accommodate her pregnancy, waited nearby. "Can you ride?" Iron Hawk asked. Clara nodded, though in truth she was far from certain. Her experience was limited to placid farm horses, not mountain trails. "Good. We travel until sunset. The killers will not follow into our lands." As they rode away from the cabin, Clara cast one last glance back, wondering if she would ever see Caleb again, or if his act of sacrifice would be their final interaction. The mountains that had seemed so threatening now felt like they held secrets she was only beginning to understand. Dangers, yes, but also unexpected allies and pathways to survival. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across their path as they climbed higher, moving deeper into Cheyenne territory. Behind them, on the western horizon, where Caleb had led the Rattlesnake Scouts, dark clouds gathered once more. A storm was brewing, both literally in the mountains and figuratively in the conflict that had drawn them all into its vortex. As they rode, Ironhawk kept a steady pace beside Clara, his weathered face revealing little emotion. Yet occasionally his eyes would scan her posture, noting her discomfort with the practiced assessment of someone accustomed to evaluating physical endurance. The child moved strongly, he observed after one particularly visible shift of Clara's belly beneath her coat. Surprised by his perception, Clara nodded. Yes, more active since yesterday. This is good. Strong spirits prepare for difficult journeys before they arrive. He gestured toward the mountain path ahead. Likewise, travelers. Your English is very good, Clara remarked, seeking conversation to distract herself from the growing ache in her back. Ironhawk's expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes, memory perhaps, or old pain. I spent 2 winters at the white man's school when I was young, before I understood that some knowledge carries a high price. He adjusted his horse's direction slightly to navigate a rocky section. Later, I guided for the railroad surveys. That is where I met Weston. He said he helped your son. Ironhawk nodded once sharply. 3 summers passed. My youngest swift arrow was caught when the mountain face broke apart during a hunt. His leg was crushed beneath stone. The other white guide said to leave him, that he would die anyway. His voice remained even, but his knuckles whitened on the reins. Weston stayed worked through the night to free my son, carried him for 2 days to our camp. The story filled in another piece of the complex man who had saved her life. He seems to have a habit of rescuing people, Clara said softly. He carries ghosts, Ironhawk replied. Some men run from such spirits, others seek to balance them with actions. He glanced at her. You carry ghosts now, too. The blunt assessment struck Clara with unexpected force. Yes, she carried ghosts. Thomas, their friends, the future they had planned together. And like Caleb, she was finding that survival required more than simply continuing to breathe. It demanded purpose. They crested a ridge that offered a sweeping view of the valley below. In the distance, a cluster of lodges stood beside a winding river, smoke rising from cook fires into the clear air, the Cheyenne winter camp. We will reach our people by nightfall, Ironhawk announced. My wife Prairie Flower will prepare a place for you. She has brought many children into the world, both our people and others. The thought of giving birth among strangers was terrifying, yet strangely comforting, compared to the alternative of facing it alone in the wilderness. Clara found herself suddenly overwhelmed with gratitude for this unexpected turn of events. Thank you, she said simply, for helping a woman you don't know. Ironhawk was silent for a long moment before responding. When the great war between white men ended, an army captain came to our autumn grounds. He said, "We must move to new lands set aside for us, lands with poor hunting and little water." His eyes remained fixed on the distant camp. When our elders refused, he ordered his men to burn our lodges and shoot our horses. Clara listened, uncertain why he was sharing this painful history. A white woman was with him, the captain's wife. When she saw our children running from the flames, she stood between our people and the soldiers' rifles. She shamed her husband before his men until he ordered them to stop. Ironhawk finally turned to meet Clara's gaze. I do not know what became of that woman, but my youngest daughter lived because of her courage. Not all people are the same, Clara said quietly, regardless of where they come from. This is a truth many forget. Ironhawk nudged his horse forward. Come, the path grows steeper before it eases. As they descended toward the valley, one of the warriors who had been scouting ahead returned at a gallop, speaking rapidly in Cheyenne. Ironhawk's expression darkened as he listened. What is it? Clara asked, fear clutching at her heart. The Rattlesnake Gang. No, yellow sickness flags at the trading post in the eastern valley. Ironhawk's tone was grim. Smallpox. The trader sends warning to stay away. The news sent a ripple of tension through the small group. Disease had devastated native populations repeatedly over the decades, a fact Clara knew well from stories that had reached even her Missouri home. Will this change our course? She asked. No, but it closes another path that might have helped Weston when he returns. Ironhawk signaled to his men, who spread out in a protective formation around Clara. We must be more cautious now. The sickness brings fear, and fear makes men act foolishly. As they continued their journey, Clara felt the baby shift again, a rolling movement followed by a sharp kick just beneath her ribs. The discomfort was familiar, but something felt different, more intense, more purposeful. A twinge of pain wrapped around her lower back, then faded. She took a deep breath, trying to assess whether this was simply the strain of riding or something more significant. The mountains around them, beautiful but unforgiving, suddenly seemed to close in, emphasizing how far she was from anything familiar. Thomas should have been with her for this moment. They should have been safely settled in Oregon, with a proper midwife engaged and a cradle built by his hands waiting for their child. Instead, she was riding toward a native winter camp with strangers while the man who had saved her life led killers away across treacherous terrain. Another pain gripped her stronger this time. Clara gasped, clutching the special saddle horn. Ironhawk noticed immediately. "The child comes. I'm not sure," she admitted, trying to recall what Abigail Wilson had told her about the early signs of labor. "It might be too soon." The Cheyenne chief assessed her briefly, then made a decision. "We will not risk it on the trail. There is a summer hunting lodge ahead. We can reach it before darkness." He gave orders to his men, who immediately adjusted their course toward a stand of pines partway down the valley slope. Clara focused on her breathing as they rode, counting the minutes between the waves of discomfort. They were irregular, still perhaps false labor brought on by exertion and emotional strain. As they approached the hunting lodge, a sturdy log structure larger than Caleb's cabin, Ironhawk dispatched one of his warriors toward the main camp. "To bring prairie flower," he explained. The remaining men efficiently prepared the lodge, starting a fire in its central pit and arranging furs for comfort. "Rest now," Ironhawk instructed as he helped Clara dismount and guided her inside. "The women will come soon. They know what to do." Alone in the lodge, Clara sank onto the furs, her hand resting protectively over her belly as another pain gripped her. Whether it was true labor or a warning, she could no longer deny that her body was preparing for what lay ahead. Outside, she could hear the Cheyenne warriors establishing a defensive perimeter around the lodge, their movements purposeful and vigilant. They were taking no chances with her safety, honoring their debt to Caleb with unwavering commitment. As darkness fell completely and the warmth of the fire filled the lodge, Clara found herself caught between fear and a strange sense of acceptance. No matter what happened now, whether her child came tonight or days from now, whether Caleb returned from his dangerous mission or fell to the rattlesnake gang's bullets, she had survived when all seemed lost. She had found unexpected allies in a hostile wilderness. And perhaps most importantly, she had discovered a strength within herself that no massacre could extinguish. Dawn broke with a clarity that belied the turmoil of the night. Clara sat propped against furs near the lodge's fire pit, cradling her newborn son in her arms. His tiny face, peaceful in sleep after hours of determined struggle to enter the world, bore a striking resemblance to Thomas around the chin and brow. "William," she whispered, testing the name she and Thomas had chosen months ago. It felt right, a connection to the father he would never know. Prairie flower. Ironhawk's wife moved quietly around the lodge, preparing a herbal tea. The Cheyenne midwife had arrived just as Clara's labor intensified, bringing with her a quiet confidence and skilled hands that had guided both mother and child safely through a difficult birth. "He has strong lungs," Prairie Flower observed, her English heavily accented but clear. "This is good. Strong voice means strong spirit." Clara smiled wearily. William had indeed announced his arrival with powerful cries that probably echoed across the valley. "Thank you for your help. I don't know what would have happened without you." Prairie Flower nodded, accepting the gratitude as her due. "First babies often come when they choose not when expected. You are fortunate he waited until we reached shelter." The lodge entrance opened, admitting Ironhawk and the morning light. He approached with the formal respect of someone aware he was intruding in women's domain, his eyes taking in the scene with quiet approval. "The boy-child breathes the mountain air on his first dawn," he said. "A good sign." "Have you heard anything about Caleb?" Clara asked the question that had been foremost in her mind since labor began. Ironhawk's expression revealed nothing. "My men watch the trails. There is no word yet." "But the Rattlesnake Gang, have they been seen near your territory?" "4 riders scouted our eastern boundaries yesterday. They did not cross our markers." His steady gaze conveyed what went unspoken. The gang was still searching still. A threat. Prairie Flower handed Clara a wooden cup of tea. "Drink. It helps the milk come and strengthens the blood." As Clara sipped the bitter liquid, Ironhawk continued, "When you are strong enough to travel, we will move you and the child to our main camp. There is better protection there." The practical considerations of her situation pressed down on Clara with renewed urgency. She had survived the massacre. She had delivered a healthy child against impossible odds. But what came next? How would she protect William in a world where men like the Rattlesnake Gang operated with seeming impunity? "How long can we stay with your people?" she asked directly. Ironhawk and Prairie Flower exchanged glances before he answered. "Until the moon of returning birds, when spring opens the mountain passes. After that," he shrugged slightly. "The army moves more freely then. They do not welcome white women living among us. 3 months at most then. A temporary sanctuary, not a permanent solution. And if Caleb doesn't return, then you must decide your own path." Ironhawk replied, "The fort lies 8 days' journey east when the snow melts, or there are settlements to the south where a woman with skills might find a place." William stirred against her breast, his tiny hands flexing as he rooted hungrily. With Prairie Flower's guidance, Clara adjusted her position to feed him. As her son nursed, a strange clarity settled over Clara's thoughts. The woman who had left Missouri with Thomas, naive dependent defined by her role as wife, no longer existed. In her place was someone forged by loss and survival, someone who had crossed through fire and emerged transformed. "I need to learn," she said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been since giving birth. "How to track, how to hunt, how to read the land like Caleb does, how to protect my son in this wilderness." Surprise flickered across Ironhawk's stoic features. "These are not things white women typically ask to learn." "I'm not a typical white woman anymore," Clara replied with a certainty that surprised even herself. "And the world William was born into isn't the one I expected to give him." Prairie Flower studied her thoughtfully. "The birthing time changes women, opens eyes to new paths." She nodded once decisively. "I will teach you our plants, which heal, which feed, which harm. My daughter Swift Doe can show how women set snares for rabbits and ground birds." Ironhawk seemed less convinced. "And if Weston returns, will you still wish to learn these things?" "Especially then," Clara said firmly, "because I won't sit safely behind while others risk everything to protect us. Not anymore." Something like respect showed in the chief's eyes before he nodded and departed, leaving the women and infant to their necessary rest. The next 6 days passed in a blur of recovery, adaptation, and growing anxiety about Caleb's fate. Clara and William were moved to the Cheyenne main camp, where they were given a small lodge near the center of the settlement. The Cheyenne women, initially cautious, gradually accepted Clara's presence as they witnessed her determination to learn their ways. True to her word, Prairie Flower began teaching Clara about medicinal plants, showing her how to identify winter herbs that could be harvested even beneath snow. Swift Doe, a young woman of perhaps 18 with sharp eyes and quicker hands, demonstrated the setting of rabbit snares and explained how to process the small game for both meat and fur. Clara absorbed these lessons with an intensity born of necessity. Each new skill represented another chance for William's survival if they found themselves alone again. Each day without word of Caleb increased the likelihood that she would indeed need to rely solely on herself. On the 7th morning, as Clara sat outside her lodge, practicing the construction of a particular knot, Swift Doe had shown her, a commotion at the camp's edge drew her attention. Warriors gathered, hands moving to weapons, as a single figure approached on foot through the eastern trail. Clutching William to her chest, Clara stood straining to see through the crowd. The warriors parted as Ironhawk moved to meet the newcomer, his posture alert but not openly hostile. When she glimpsed the approaching figure, her heart leaped. Caleb unmistakable even at a distance. He moved with a pronounced limp, supported partially by a crude walking stick, but he was undeniably alive. Clara moved forward without conscious thought, William secure in his carrier across her chest. As she approached, Caleb looked up, his weathered face showing momentary shock as he registered the bundle she carried. "You've been busy?" he said, his voice hoarse from what sounded like exhaustion. "You've been gone?" she replied, searching his face and body for signs of serious injury. Ironhawk spoke rapidly in Cheyenne, and 2 men approached to help Caleb, who was clearly injured beyond just the limp. He shook his head, refusing to relinquish his standing position. "The Rattlesnake Scouts," Clara asked, dreading the answer. "Won't be reporting back to Rattler," Caleb replied with grim certainty. The flat statement carried unmistakable finality. "Are you being followed?" Ironhawk asked sharply. "No," Caleb said, "but the main gang will know something's wrong when their scouts don't return. They'll send more men." "You need food and rest," Clara said, noticing how Caleb's gaze kept returning to William's tiny face. "This is William," she added softly. "He arrived the night after you left." Something flickered in Caleb's eyes, a complex mixture of pain relief and something deeper she couldn't quite identify. Without speaking, he reached out a tentative finger to touch the edge of the blanket wrapping the infant. "He has his father's chin," Caleb observed quietly. "And his mother's stubbornness," Prairie Flower added as she approached. "Come, your wounds need tending." As the Cheyenne healers worked on Caleb's injuries, a bullet grazed along his right thigh and a deeper knife wound on his left shoulder. Clara sat nearby, William sleeping peacefully in a cradle board gifted by the tribe. "I led them north into Broken Canyon," Caleb explained between winces as a poultice was applied to his shoulder. "Planned to lose them in the maze of dead ends, but they were more familiar with the territory than I expected. 2 of them circled behind me." "How many were there?" Ironhawk asked. 4, Rattler's best trackers." Caleb's jaw tightened. It was close, too close. Clara understood what he wasn't saying, that he had nearly died out there alone in the wilderness. "While you recovered," she said, changing the subject, "I've been learning tracking small game, identifying plants, setting snares." Caleb's eyebrows rose slightly. Ironhawk agreed to this. "I didn't give him much choice," Clara replied, a hint of steel in her voice. "I won't be helpless again, not when William's life depends on it." A shadow of approval crossed Caleb's face before pain made him grimace as the healer tightened a bandage. "The child needs a father," Prairie Flower said suddenly, her blunt statement hanging in the air between them. "And you, Weston, need something to live for beyond revenge." Both Clara and Caleb stared at the older woman, momentarily speechless. Prairie Flower continued her work without looking up, as if she had commented on nothing more consequential than the weather. "I think," Caleb finally said, his voice carefully neutral, "that we all need to focus on surviving the next few weeks. Rattler won't stop looking." Ironhawk, who had been listening silently, nodded in agreement. "The killers have lost 4 men. They will be angry, more dangerous. And I found something in their saddlebags that makes our situation even more precarious," Caleb added. With his good arm, he reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, handing it to Ironhawk. The chief examined it, his expression darkening. "A map of our winter territories marked with soldier symbols." "The army?" Clara asked, alarmed. Caleb shook his head. "Not the official military. Mercenaries being paid to clear hostile natives from lands that suddenly have value." He met Ironhawk's eyes. The land deeds in that surveyor's chest didn't just establish boundaries. They reclassified Cheyenne winter hunting grounds as open for settlement. A tense silence followed this revelation. The implications were clear. The Rattlesnake Gang wasn't just a group of outlaws. They were working as advance men for powerful interests who wanted the Cheyenne removed. "How long before they move against us?" Ironhawk asked. "Not until spring," Caleb replied. "They'll wait for better weather before bringing in a larger force, but they'll keep hunting for Clara and me in the meantime. We're the only witnesses who could connect them to the massacre." "So, we have maybe 2 months," Clara said, her mind already calculating, "to do what run, fight, try to reach the authorities." "The local authorities are likely compromised," Caleb reminded her. "But there's a federal judge in Denver who's been investigating land fraud. Judge Thornton has no love for territorial officials who make private arrangements with men like Rattler." Swift Doe, who had been listening from the lodge entrance, spoke up. "The hunting party that returned yesterday spoke of soldiers at the northern trading post, not mercenaries, real blue coats with official papers." Ironhawk considered this information. "My cousin trades at that post. He could learn if these soldiers can be trusted." For the first time, Clara felt a flicker of hope. If legitimate federal authorities were in the region, there might be a path to justice after all. "We need more than just our testimony," she said thoughtfully. "We need proof of the connection between the Rattlesnake Gang and whoever is behind the land grab." Caleb's expression shifted, a calculating look entering his eyes. The deeds and maps from the surveyor's chest would provide that connection. Rattler wouldn't have kept them with the scouts, but he'd have them at their main camp, Ironhawk pointed out. Which you still haven't located. No, but I'm closer. Before I encountered the scouts, I found signs of a larger encampment near Eagle Rock. Heavy traffic, multiple horses' supplies for extended stay. Clara watched as the men began formulating possibilities, searching for a way forward that didn't end in death for all of them. Prairie Flower caught her eye and gave a subtle nod toward the door. Understanding the gesture, Clara followed the older woman outside, bringing William with her. The winter air was brisk but not bitter, the sun providing welcome warmth. Around them, the life of the camp continued, women tanning hides, elderly men carving wood children, playing despite the cold. A normal day, though, the conversations within the lodge threatened all of this tranquility. Men think only of fighting or running. Prairie Flower said, guiding Clara toward a group of women working on winter moccasins. Women must think of living of continuing, learn while they plan. For the next hour, Clara absorbed another skill, her fingers gradually mastering the techniques of shaping and stitching the soft deer hide. All the while, her mind worked on the problem from different angles. By the time she returned to the lodge, Caleb and Ironhawk had moved to a larger council meeting with the tribe's elders. William had awoken hungry, and as she nursed him in the privacy of her lodge, Clara came to a decision. When Caleb entered later that evening, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes alert with purpose, she had already prepared her argument. "You're planning to go after the documents at the rattlesnake camp," she said before he could speak. "Alone. It offers the best chance," he replied, easing himself onto a fur beside the fire, his injured leg stretched out. Ironhawk can't risk his warriors in what would be seen as an act of aggression. It would give Rattler's backers the excuse they need to move against the Cheyenne immediately. "And you think sacrificing yourself is the solution?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "I'm not planning to die just to retrieve evidence that could save all of us." Clara studied his face in the firelight, the determination, the barely concealed pain, the exhaustion he was fighting. "And if you're caught, if you're killed, what happens to your evidence then? What happens to your promise to your niece?" His expression faltered. "Emma is safe with my sister-in-law in St. Louis. She'll be taken care of." "That's not the same as having you come back for her as you promised." A heavy silence fell between them, broken only by William's soft breathing as he slept in his cradleboard. "I've been thinking about the problem differently," Clara said finally. "The Rattlesnake Gang is looking for two people, you and me. They know your skills, your appearance, your methods. They're prepared for you." Caleb's eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "They're not prepared for me. A woman alone, seemingly vulnerable. I could approach their camp from the direction of the fort, claiming to be a widow traveling to join family. No one who saw the massacre survived, so they wouldn't recognize me." "Absolutely not," Caleb said flatly. "It's suicide, and you have William to consider." "I'm not suggesting charging into their camp with guns blazing," Clara countered. "Just gathering information, learning the layout, identifying where Rattler might keep valuable documents, information you would need for any attempt to retrieve the evidence, and William would remain here protected by the tribe." Caleb shook his head emphatically. "Rattler's men wouldn't hesitate to kill a woman traveling a lone widow's story, or not. They're not taking chances. Which is why I wouldn't be alone," Clara continued. "Prairie Flower suggested something today that made me think. The Cheyenne women trade at the same posts as white settlers. With the right clothing, the right companion I could pass as a mixed-blood woman traveling with her Cheyenne aunt." The idea clearly caught Caleb off guard. "You've discussed this with Prairie Flower. She suggested it before I even formed the plan. The Cheyenne have their own stake in this fight. They just can't be seen as the aggressors." Caleb considered this, his tactical mind working through the possibilities. "Who would go with you?" "Swift Doe. She speaks English well enough, knows the trading posts, and can move through white settlements without drawing too much attention. We wouldn't approach the Rattlesnake Camp directly, just gather information at the places where they resupply. Trading posts, small settlements." "It's still incredibly dangerous," Caleb argued, but with less conviction. The strategy had merit, and they both knew it. "Less dangerous than you stumbling into their camp alone, injured and outnumbered," Clara countered. "This way we work together. You continue healing and planning, while Swift Doe and I scout the periphery. And if you're discovered, we'll have a story ready that I witnessed unusual activity and reported it to the soldiers at the northern post. that I'm helping the army identify outlaws in exchange for safe passage to Denver. Caleb's expression showed reluctant admiration. You've thought this through. I've had to, Clara said simply. For William's sake. After a long moment, Caleb nodded slowly. I'll speak with Ironhawk. If he agrees, and if we can establish a secure way for you to report back what you learn, it might work. His eyes held hers. But at the first sign of danger, you withdraw immediately. Agreed, Clara said, relief washing through her. She had expected a much harder fight. You're not the same woman I found in that wolf's den, Caleb observed quietly. No, she agreed. I'm not. The next morning, a council convened in Ironhawk's lodge. Clara presented her plan to the tribal elders with Swift Doe at her side. The young woman had readily agreed to accompany Clara, her eyes bright with the determination of youth and the wisdom of one raised to face hardships directly. The woman's plan has merit, Ironhawk said after a lengthy discussion, but it requires careful preparation. 2 women traveling alone will draw attention regardless of their story. 3 women would be less suspicious, Prairie Flower suggested. I will accompany them as far as the trading post. My presence will lend credibility to their story among both our people and the whites. One of the elders raised an objection in Cheyenne. Ironhawk responded at length, his tone firm but respectful. Clara caught enough of the exchange to understand the concern. Placing 3 women at risk seemed foolhardy to some. The risk exists whether we act or not. Prairie Flower replied in English, clearly intending her words for Clara and Caleb as much as for her people. The rattlesnake killers will not stop hunting. The men who seek our land will not abandon their plans. Better to fight with cleverness than to wait for arrows to find us. Caleb, who had been listening silently, finally spoke. I don't like risking anyone else in my fight. It is not just your fight, Swift Doe said, her English accented but clear. These men threaten my people's hunting grounds, threaten the peace of our winter camp. They murdered my husband and friends, Clara added quietly. This fight belongs to all of us now. As the council continued debating details and contingencies, Clara felt a strange sense of purpose solidifying within her. The grief remained a constant companion that would likely never fully leave her. But alongside it now grew something else, a determination not just to survive, but to ensure that the evil represented by the Rattlesnake Gang and their powerful backers faced consequences. The preparations began that afternoon. Clothing was assembled, a mix of native and settler garments that would support their story of mixed heritage. Ironhawk's cousin was dispatched to the northern trading post to gather information about the soldiers stationed there and to establish contact if they proved trustworthy. Maps were drawn showing trading posts and settlements where the Rattlesnake Gang might appear. Routes were planned with contingencies for weather and danger. A system of messages using Cheyenne hunting signs was devised, allowing Clara and Swift Doe to communicate findings back to the camp without risking direct contact. As evening approached, Clara stood at the edge of the camp, William bundled against her chest, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Caleb joined her, moving more easily, now that the tribe's medicine had begun to take effect on his wounds. Are you certain about this? He asked, his eyes on the distant peaks. No, Clara admitted, but I'm certain about what happens if we do nothing. Rattler's men will keep searching until they find us. Their employers will move against the Cheyenne when spring comes. William will never be safe. Caleb was silent for a long moment. When I found you in that wolf's den, I thought I was just fulfilling a duty protecting a helpless survivor. I never expected— Neither did I, Clara said softly. But here we are. Here we are. He echoed, his hand tentatively finding hers in the fading light, planning a dangerous mission instead of running for safety. Clara's fingers tightened around his. I'm done running. The Rattlesnake Gang took everything from me except William and my life. I won't give them a moment's peace until they've answered for what they've done. The steel in her voice matched the resolve that had been forged through trials most would find unbearable. She was no longer just a survivor. She had become a fighter, strategist, mother, and avenger. 3 days later, as dawn broke clear and cold over the mountains, Clara stood beside Swift Doe and Prairie Flower, prepared for departure. William, wrapped in the finest furs the tribe could provide, was being held by an elderly woman known for her skill with infants. He would remain under the protection of the tribe and Caleb until Clara returned. Caleb approached his limp, less pronounced, but his expression grave. 6 days. He said, his tone leaving no room for debate. If you haven't returned or sent word by then, I'm coming after you. We'll be back before then. Clara assured him, her confidence higher than she truly felt, with the information we need to end this. As she bent to kiss William's forehead one last time, whispering promises of return in his tiny ear, Clara felt, rather than saw, Caleb's hand move briefly to touch her shoulder, a gesture of support, and something more complex that neither of them was ready to name. The three women mounted their horses, Clara riding the same specially designed saddle that had carried her to safety days earlier. As they prepared to depart, Ironhawk approached and handed Clara a small leather pouch. "Wear this," he instructed. "It carries medicine for protection and clear thinking." Clara slipped the cord over her head, tucking the pouch beneath her clothing. With a final nod to Caleb and a last look at William, she turned her horse toward the eastern trail and the dangers that awaited beyond the safety of the Cheyenne camp. Their journey had begun not toward escape, but toward confrontation with those who had shattered so many lives. As they rode, the rising sun cast their shadows long across the snow behind them, three silhouettes moving with purpose into the uncertain future. The journey to the first trading post took 2 full days, following winding trails through snow-covered forests. Prairie Flower led the way, her knowledge of the landscape proving invaluable as they navigated terrain that would have confused most settlers. Clara rode in the middle, constantly scanning their surroundings for signs of danger, while Swift Doe brought up the rear, occasionally doubling back to ensure they weren't being followed. The harsh winter climate provided both protection and peril. Few travelers ventured into the mountains during this season, reducing the chance of chance encounters with the Rattlesnake Gang. However, the cold itself posed a constant threat, requiring careful management of their resources and frequent stops to warm themselves. They camped the first night in a sheltered grove of pines, building a small fire that produced minimal smoke. As they huddled around the meager warmth, Clara found herself thinking of William, wondering if he was sleeping peacefully in the Cheyenne camp, if Caleb was keeping his promise to watch over the infant. The separation carved an ache in her chest, but she pushed the pain aside, focusing instead on their mission. "Tomorrow we reach Wilson's trading post," Prairie Flower said, passing a cup of pine needle tea to Clara. "Many eyes there, many ears. We must be careful what we say, how we move." "What should I expect?" Clara asked. Swift Doe answered her English, improving with each conversation. "Trappers, miners who winter in mountains, some settlers, few soldiers sometimes." She adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. "Men who drink too much, men who talk too much. And that's what we need," Clara said thoughtfully. "Men who talk too much." Prairie Flower nodded approvingly. "You learn quickly, daughter of sorrow." The title startled Clara, but she recognized the respect behind it. Among the Cheyenne, many names reflected life experiences rather than family connections. Daughter of Sorrow acknowledged both her losses and her strength in facing them. "When we arrive," Prairie Flower continued, "I will speak with Wilson the owner. He has known me many winters. Swift Doe will listen among the women who work there. You will sit quiet watching the men who come and go." Clara understood the strategy. Her task was observation, identifying members of the Rattlesnake Gang, or those who might have dealings with them. Prairie Flower would gather information through direct conversation, while Swift Doe would collect the gossip that flowed freely among the women who cooked, cleaned, and served at such establishments. "If we are questioned," Prairie Flower added, "you are my niece from a mixed marriage. Your husband died in a mining accident. We travel to Fort Laramie where your mother's family lives." Clara committed the story to memory, adding details from her own life to make it more convincing. By the time they extinguished their small fire and settled into their bedrolls, she had constructed a complete identity for herself. Clara Taylor, widow of a miner named Jack, traveling with her Cheyenne relatives after tragedy left her alone in the world. They reached Wilson's trading post shortly after noon the following day. The outpost consisted of a main building that served as store, tavern, and gathering place, surrounded by several smaller cabins for lodging. Smoke rose from multiple chimneys, indicating a busy day, despite the harsh weather. As they approached, Clara adjusted her appearance one final time. She wore a mixture of settler clothing and native garments, enough to suggest mixed heritage without appearing too foreign to white traders. Her dark hair, arranged in a simple braid, would pass casual inspection. In the weeks with the Cheyenne, her skin had weathered enough to make the deception plausible. Three men lounged on the trading post's porch, despite the cold smoking pipes, and watching their arrival with obvious interest. Clara kept her eyes downcast as Prairie Flower led them to the hitching post, aware that a woman traveling in winter was unusual enough to attract attention. "New faces," one of the men commented as they dismounted. "Don't often see ladies on the trail this time of year." Prairie Flower responded with a simple nod, helping Clara with her pack, while Swift Doe secured the horses. The men continued watching, but made no move to interfere as the women entered the trading post. The interior was warm and smoky, crowded with perhaps 15 men in various states of intoxication, despite the early hour. A large wood stove dominated the center of the room, surrounded by tables where card games proceeded with intense concentration. At the rear, a long counter served as both bar and trading area, staffed by a heavy-set man with an impressive mustache. Prairie Flower moved directly toward him, recognition dawning on the man's face as she approached. "Star!" He greeted her, his voice carrying over the general noise of the room. "Haven't seen you since last spring's trade. What brings you through in this weather?" Clara noticed how the room quieted briefly, men turning to assess the newcomers before resuming their conversations at a slightly lower volume. She kept her gaze moving, cataloging faces, looking for anyone who matched Caleb's descriptions of the Rattlesnake Gang. "Family matters, Wilson." Prairie Flower replied, gesturing toward Clara. "My niece travels to her mother's people at the fort. We need supplies and perhaps a night's lodging before continuing." Wilson's eyes assessed Clara with open curiosity. "Half-blood?" he asked bluntly. Clara met his gaze with the appropriate mix of deference and dignity her role required. "My father was a trapper who married into the tribe," she said, keeping her voice soft. "My mother's family is at Fort Laramie." The explanation seemed to satisfy him. "Got a cabin you ladies can use for the night. $2 includes meals." He leaned closer to Prairie Flower. "You should know the post is more crowded than usual. Some rough types came through yesterday. Not your usual trappers." Prairie Flower's expression revealed nothing, but Clara felt a surge of anticipation. "We will manage," the older woman said. "First we need supplies." As Prairie Flower negotiated for what they needed, Clara moved to a corner table, positioning herself to observe the room while remaining inconspicuous. Swift Doe disappeared toward the kitchen area, where several women worked seamlessly, integrating herself into their activity. For the next hour, Clara watched and listened, her attention particularly drawn to a group of 4 men who sat apart from the others. Unlike the trappers and miners who dominated the room, these men were better armed and more watchful. Their conversation never rose above a murmur, and they positioned themselves with clear sightlines to both doors. One of them, a tall man, with a face scarred by what appeared to be burn marks, periodically checked his pocket watch and glanced toward the windows. They were waiting for someone. Clara's suspicions deepened when she caught fragments of their conversation during a lull in the general noise. "Supposed to rendezvous by noon. Rattler doesn't tolerate delays. Might have found something near the Cheyenne camp." The name Rattler confirmed what she had already suspected. These were rattlesnake men, perhaps waiting for the return of the scouts who would never arrive thanks to Caleb's intervention. The mention of the Cheyenne camp sent a chill through her. How close had they come to discovering their location? When Swift Doe returned from the kitchen, she slid into the seat beside Clara, arranging a plate of food between them as cover for their conversation. "The women say many strangers have passed through in recent weeks," she murmured, breaking a piece of bread. "Men with good horses and poor manners. They pay well but frighten everyone. One man with red beard leads them." "Henry Rattler," Clara whispered, recalling Caleb's description of the second in command. Her pulse quickened. "They speak of a camp near Eagle Rock," Swift Doe continued, "a place usually avoided because of difficult terrain and wolf packs." The cook overheard them discussing papers and maps kept in a strongbox. The information aligned perfectly with what they sought. Eagle Rock was less than 20 miles from their current position, within striking distance if they moved quickly. Before Clara could respond, the trading post door swung open, admitting a blast of cold air and 2 new arrivals. The room fell silent as everyone turned to assess the newcomers. Clara's blood froze. Standing in the doorway removing snow from his coat was a tall man with a russet beard, Henry Rattler himself, exactly as Caleb had described him. Beside him stood a younger man with the same harsh features, clearly a relative. The 4 men at the corner table immediately stood, greeting the newcomers with obvious deference. Henry Rattler nodded to them before scanning the room, his cold gaze passing over Clara without particular interest. He moved toward the bar, his presence causing conversations to resume at a noticeably reduced volume. Clara lowered her head, using the movement to conceal her face while still observing through her lashes. Rattler ordered whiskey, speaking to Wilson in a voice that expected immediate compliance. As the barkeeper served him, Rattler asked a question that confirmed their worst fears. "Any strangers come through here in the past few days? I'm looking for a man traveling alone. Tall fellow with a scar along his jaw. Might have a woman with him." Wilson shook his head. "Just the usual winter traffic. Few trappers, some miners waiting out the weather." He gestured vaguely toward Clara and Swift Doe. "These ladies arrived today heading for the fort. Nobody matching your description." Rattler's gaze returned to Clara, more assessing this time. She kept her eyes down her posture, submissive, praying he wouldn't approach for a closer look. "If your man shows up," Wilson continued, clearly uncomfortable with the scrutiny directed at his customers, "what should I tell him?" A cold smile touched Rattler's bearded face. "Tell him his friends are looking for him. Tell him we've got something that belongs to him." He tossed back his whiskey. "We'll be back through tomorrow. Anyone matching that description shows up, you hold them here. There's $50 in it for you." The implication was clear. Rattler believed Caleb might come looking for Clara, using her as bait to draw him out. He had no idea she was already within arm's reach, gathering the very information that might destroy him. Rattler and his companion departed after a brief, hushed conversation with the four men at the corner table. Two of those men followed him out, while the other two remained clearly assigned to watch the trading post. Clara waited until she was certain Rattler had ridden away before making eye contact with Prairie Flower, who had observed everything from her position near the counter. A subtle nod passed between them. They had what they needed: confirmation of the gang's presence and the location of their camp. Now they needed to extricate themselves without arousing suspicion. Prairie Flower approached their table, speaking in Cheyenne for the benefit of anyone listening. Clara responded in kind, using one of the phrases she had learned specifically for this purpose. To observers, it would appear to be nothing more than family conversation. In reality, Prairie Flower was instructing them to prepare for immediate departure. The plan to stay overnight had become too dangerous, with rattlesnake men actively watching the trading post. They needed to leave while Rattler was away, taking advantage of the narrow window before his return. Swift Doe rose casually, gathering their few belongings. "I check horses," she said, in deliberately broken English, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Cold coming, maybe snow again." The deception worked. No one paid particular attention as Swift Doe exited Nor when Clara and Prairie Flower completed their purchases and prepared to leave half an hour later. The two rattlesnake men remained focused on the door, watching for Caleb, not suspecting that the information they guarded was already walking out under their noses. Once outside, they discovered that Swift Doe had already prepared the horses, positioning them behind the trading post, where they could mount without being observed from the main trail. "We cannot return to camp directly," Prairie Flower said, as they rode away, taking a winding path through the trees that would conceal their true direction. "Those men will watch all approaches." "We need to get word to Caleb," Clara agreed. "Rattler is closing in on the Cheyenne camp. He mentioned finding something there." "I know a place," Swift Doe offered. "A hunting cabin used by my uncle. In summer, it lies between here and Eagle Rock. We can send a message to Ironhawk from there." The hunting cabin proved to be little more than a crude shelter abandoned for the winter, but serviceable for their immediate needs. While Prairie Flower prepared a small fire, Swift Doe demonstrated the Cheyenne method of creating message sticks, carved pieces of wood bearing symbols that conveyed information to those who knew how to read them. "Be careful," she said instead, clasping the younger woman's hand. "William needs his aunt to return safely." Swift Doe's eyes widened slightly at the familiar designation before a smile touched her lips. "I return before dawn. Keep Prairie Flower from too much worry." After Swift Doe departed, Clara and Prairie Flower settled in to wait, planning their next move. The discovery of the rattlesnake camp's location was valuable, but incomplete. They still needed to determine the layout, the number of men present, and most importantly, the location of the documents they sought. "Tomorrow we must go closer to Eagle Rock," Prairie Flower said, her weathered face solemn in the firelight. "See with our own eyes what strength these killers have." "It's too dangerous," Clara objected. "Rattler knows to look for a woman now. If he sees us, he looks for white woman with a scar-faced man, Prairie Flower countered. Not Cheyenne woman with mixed blood niece. We go carefully, see only what is needed, then return here to wait for Weston. Clara slept fitfully that night, her dreams filled with images of Rattler, discovering William of Caleb, falling to rattlesnake bullets of herself, standing helplessly by, as everything she had left was destroyed. She woke before dawn, her determination hardened by the nightmares. Swift Doe had not yet returned, but neither she nor Prairie Flower had expected her before first light. They prepared a small breakfast and readied themselves for the scouting mission, layering their clothing against the bitter cold and checking their meager weapons, a knife for each of them, and the revolver Caleb had given Clara, still loaded with 6 precious bullets. As the first gray light of dawn filtered through the trees, they heard approaching hoofbeats, not the single horse they expected, but multiple riders moving at speed. Prairie Flower extinguished their small fire immediately, while Clara moved to the cabin's single window, peering cautiously through a crack in the shutters. Her heart nearly stopped. Approaching through the trees were 4 riders, Caleb in the lead, followed by Ironhawk and 2 Cheyenne warriors. There was no sign of Swift Doe. Clara threw open the cabin door, heedless of caution in her alarm. "Caleb, where's Swift Doe?" The grim expression on his face told her everything before he even dismounted. Rattler's men intercepted her about 5 miles from camp. Ironhawk's scouts found signs of struggle blood on the snow. His voice was tight with controlled rage. "They took her alive." The message stick Prairie Flower asked, her voice steady despite the devastating news. "Destroyed, but we found enough pieces to read some of what you learned." Caleb handed Clara a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. "Ironhawk sent these for you." Inside was a dress of settler design, plain but well made, along with a shawl and bonnet that would disguise her features. "I don't understand," she said, looking from the clothing to Caleb. "Rattler knows Swift Doe was traveling with 2 other women. He'll be looking for Cheyenne and mixed bloods now." Caleb's expression was deadly serious. "Our only advantage is that he doesn't know who you really are. With these you can pass as a proper settler woman, a missionary's wife perhaps, or a teacher." "You want me to infiltrate the rattlesnake camp directly?" Clara realized the audacity of the plan, striking her full force. "No," Caleb corrected. "I want you safely away from here back at the Cheyenne camp with William, but Swift Doe's capture changes everything. We can't wait any longer. Rattler will torture her for information, and eventually she'll have no choice but to reveal what she knows." The brutal assessment hung in the air. They all recognized the truth. No matter how brave or strong Swift Doe might be, eventually she would break under Rattler's methods. "So, we attack now?" Clara said, her mind racing ahead to the implications. "Before they're prepared, before they learn about the Cheyenne camp's location." "We have no choice," Ironhawk agreed, speaking for the first time. "My warriors prepare already. 20 men move into position around Eagle Rock by nightfall." "But the documents," Clara insisted. "We still need proof of Rattler's connections to the land fraud. Without it, there's nothing to stop his employers from sending others after the Cheyenne after us." "The documents aren't worth Swift Doe's life," Caleb said firmly. "No, they're worth many more lives," Clara countered, "including William's future, the tribe's survival, and any chance of real justice. We need both Swift Doe rescued and the evidence secured." Prairie Flower nodded slowly. "She is right, Weston. Half victory now means full battle later." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't disagree. "What are you suggesting?" "You and the warriors create a diversion enough to draw Rattler's attention away from the camp's center. Meanwhile, I enter as a lost traveler, locate Swift Doe and the documents." Clara outlined the plan that had formed in her mind. A woman alone, especially one who appears helpless, won't be seen as a threat, not until it's too late. "It's too dangerous," Caleb protested, exactly as she had expected. "Less dangerous than a frontal assault that might get Swift Doe killed in the crossfire," Clara argued. "You know I'm right, Caleb. This is why I came on this mission in the first place, because I can go where you can't." The debate continued as they rode toward Eagle Rock, but ultimately necessity overcame objection. By midday, concealed on a ridge overlooking the rattlesnake camp, they finalized their strategy. The camp was larger than expected, 8 cabins arranged in a rough semicircle around a central clearing, with guards posted at regular intervals. They counted at least 15 men, though there could be more inside the structures. Rattler's personal cabin stood at the center, distinguished by its size, and the two armed men stationed at its door. "That's where they'll keep the documents," Caleb said, studying the layout through a spyglass, "and likely Swift Doe as well for questioning." "How do we get her out and find the evidence?" Ironhawk asked. Clara had been watching the camp's routine, noting the movement of guards, the timing of patrols. "There," she said, pointing to a small shed near Rattler's cabin. "They're bringing water from that pump to the main cabin every hour. If I approach from the east appearing lost and distressed, I'll be taken to Rattler. Once inside, I can locate both Swift Doe and the documents." "And if Rattler recognizes you from Wilson's trading post," Caleb challenged. "He barely looked at me, and when he did, I was dressed as a half Cheyenne woman with my face downcast. Like this," she gestured to the settler's clothing she now wore, "I'm a different person entirely." The argument continued in hushed tones, but as the afternoon waned, they had no better alternative. The Cheyenne warriors moved into position concealed in the forest surrounding the camp. Caleb, despite his still healing injuries, would lead one group to create a distraction on the camp's western edge once Clara was inside. As dusk approached, Clara prepared herself, securing the small Derringer Ironhawk had provided beneath her skirts, and concealing a knife in her sleeve. The larger revolver would be too difficult to hide in her current attire. "If anything goes wrong," Caleb said, gripping her shoulders with an intensity that betrayed his concern, "forget the documents, just get Swift Doe and yourself out. We'll be waiting at the eastern perimeter." Clara nodded, though in her heart she had already decided she would not leave without the evidence they needed. Too much depended on it: William's future justice for Thomas and the Wagon Train family's security for the Cheyenne. "Be careful," she said, allowing herself a moment of vulnerability. "William needs you to return, too." Something flashed in Caleb's eyes, surprise perhaps, or recognition of what she was really saying. Without warning, he pulled her close, his lips finding hers in a brief, fierce kiss. "We finish this tonight," he said as they separated. "All of it." Before she could respond, he was gone, moving silently through the trees toward his position. Clara touched her fingers to her lips, momentarily stunned, before the gravity of their situation reasserted itself. Adjusting her bonnet to partially shadow her face, she began the careful descent toward the rattlesnake camp, her mind focused entirely on the dangerous game ahead. By the time she reached the edge of the clearing, darkness had fallen completely with only the camp's fires providing illumination. Taking a deep breath, Clara stepped into the light, her face arranged in an expression of distress and confusion. It was time to confront the monsters who had shattered so many lives, time to bring justice to the shadow of Bitter Mountain.